In the third quarter of 2025, Mercedes-Benz delivered 525,300 vehicles globally, a 12% collapse from the same quarter a year earlier. In China, specifically, its most profitable single market for most of the last decade, sales fell 27% year-on-year in that quarter alone, the sharpest regional decline the company had ever recorded. For the full year 2025, Mercedes delivered 505,900 vehicles in China, down 19% from 2024, which was itself already a difficult year. BMW's numbers told a nearly identical story: 625,527 vehicles delivered in China for the full year 2025, a 5% decline. Two of the most recognizable automotive brands in the history of the industry, brands that together had sold hundreds of thousands of vehicles per year in China for decades, had now posted consecutive annual drops of more than 10% in the world's largest automobile market. Volkswagen's EV sales in China alone fell more than 72% in early 2026 when Chinese government subsidies were withdrawn, exposing just how much of German automotive revenue in China had been subsidy-dependent rather than demand-driven. Ford's joint venture with Chang'an Ford, watched its Chinese sales fall from 247,000 units in 2024 to 9,400 units in 2025, a collapse so severe that for 5 consecutive months, at the start of 2025, the joint venture posted double-digit year-on-year declines every single month. These are not cyclical numbers. They are not the kind of quarterly fluctuation that appears in an analyst's model as a rounding error and gets explained away in an earnings call with language about macroeconomic headwinds. A 19% decline in Mercedes-Benz's China sales in a single year, followed by a 27% collapse in Q3 of the same year and a further 27% crash in Q1 2026, is structural erosion. It is the documented quarter-by-quarter loss of a position that European and American automakers spent decades building in what was for most of that period the fastest-growing automobile market on Earth. And the reason it is happening is not complicated, even if the consequences of it are genuinely large. China did not just build cheaper electric cars. China built better electric cars. And then China built an industrial infrastructure to support those cars: batteries, charging networks, software, autonomous driving systems, supply chains, that is now so far ahead of anything available in the West that the traditional European and American automotive model of competing on brand heritage and engineering reputation has stopped working in the market where it mattered most. By the time you finish watching this video, you're going to understand exactly what China built, why the cost gap between a Chinese-made electric vehicle and a German or American equivalent is now so large that it cannot be closed by incremental engineering improvement alone, what Mercedes and BMW and Ford are actually doing in response to a situation their own executives describe privately as an existential threat, and what happens to European and American drivers, the people who buy these cars, not the people who make them, when the companies that have supplied their vehicles for generations are fighting for survival in a market they thought was theirs. Stay with me, because the honest version of this story is more complicated than the headline suggests, and it ends somewhere that neither side of the political argument about China and cars wants to acknowledge. Let's start with the number that explains everything that follows, because without it, the scale of what is happening is impossible to understand properly. In December 2025, Bloomberg NEF published its annual lithium-ion battery price survey. The headline figure was $108 per kilowatt hour, the global average pack price for 2025, down 8% from 2024, representing a 93% decline from 2010 in real terms. That number got significant coverage. The number that got less coverage was the regional breakdown sitting directly underneath it. In China, the average lithium-ion battery pack price in 2025 was $84 per kilowatt hour. In North America, prices were 44% higher than that Chinese figure. In Europe, prices were 56% higher. To translate that into a car, you can actually picture a 75 kilowatt-hour battery pack, roughly the size of the pack in a mid-range family electric vehicle, costs approximately $6,300 to manufacture in China. The same pack costs approximately $9,070 in North America and approximately $9,140 in Europe, using the Bloomberg NEF regional differentials. That is a gap of between $2,770 and $3,540 on a single component, before a single bolt has been installed, before a door panel has been fitted, before a single hour of labor has been logged at the assembly plant. And that gap, $84 per kilowatt hour against $121 in North America and $131 in Europe, has not been narrowing at any meaningful speed. China's battery pack price fell 13% in real terms in 2025 alone, while North American prices fell 4% and European prices fell 8%. The lead is widening, not closing. If you have found this kind of specific sourced breakdown useful, the kind of coverage that goes to the actual Bloomberg Neff report instead of paraphrasing a paraphrase, hit subscribe now. This channel covers these stories every week using primary sources, and the subscribe button means you get the next one when it drops. This battery cost gap is not an isolated advantage. It is the visible tip of an industrial infrastructure that China has been building systematically for nearly 2 decades, and that is now so deeply integrated across the entire electric vehicle value chain that dismantling it would require a level of sustained Western industrial investment that no government has yet committed to at anything close to the necessary scale. China accounts for approximately 75% of global electric vehicle production, according to the International Energy Agency's Global EV Outlook 2026, published in May of that year. In 2025, China produced 16 million electric cars, a figure that outstripped Chinese domestic demand by 20%, which is why Chinese exports doubled in the same year to a record high of more than 5 million vehicles, with 4 in 5 of those exported vehicles now being made by Chinese manufacturers rather than by foreign brands producing in China. The IEA report is explicit about what that shift means. In 2021, less than 2 in 5 Chinese-made electric cars sold overseas were made by Chinese companies. By 2025, that figure had risen to 4 in 5. The export story is no longer a story about China as a manufacturing platform for Western brands. It is a story about Chinese brands using China as a manufacturing platform to enter Western markets. BYD, the company at the center of all of this, delivered 602,436 new energy vehicles globally in 2025, generating automotive segment revenue of 65 billion yuan, approximately around $6 billion, according to its full-year results. Its overseas deliveries reached 146,083 units, the first time any Chinese automaker had exported more than 1 million vehicles in a single year. And those exports came at an average selling price of approximately 186,000 yuan per vehicle, compared to an average domestic price of approximately 127,000 yuan, meaning BYD's international business generates significantly higher margins than its domestic operations. This is the detail that the China is in a price war narrative consistently misses. Yes, the domestic Chinese market is experiencing brutal competition and margin compression. BYD's automotive gross margin fell from approximately 3% in 2024 to 5% in 2025 as the price war intensified at home. But overseas, Chinese electric vehicles command a 46% price premium over their domestic equivalents and still undercut European and American competitors by significant margins. The price war is a domestic Chinese problem, the export business is a profit center, and the profit center is growing at 74% year on year. Now let's talk about what is happening to Mercedes, BMW, and Ford specifically, because the general numbers only tell part of the story. The specific responses each company has made to the competitive pressure from China tell you considerably more about how serious the situation actually is, and how little confidence the senior leadership of these companies has in the traditional playbook of better engineering and stronger brand positioning as a sufficient response to what they are facing. Mercedes-Benz ended 2025 with global EV sales of 168,800 fully electric vehicles, a 9% decline from 2024, in a global market where EV sales grew by more than 25% over the same period. The company sold 8 million total vehicles globally in 2025, marking one of its weakest annual performances in recent years, with E-Class deliveries down 10% globally and China contributing just 9% of group revenue, a share that has been declining steadily for years. The competitive threat Mercedes is responding to in China is not primarily BYD's entry-level Seagull, which starts at a price point that Mercedes has no intention of competing at. It is BYD's premium Yangwang brand. It is Xiaomi's SU7, which delivered 258,065 vehicles in China in 2025 on its first full year of sales and generated a level of brand excitement in Chinese premium consumer segments that Mercedes has not been able to replicate with any recent launch. It is Huawei-backed Aido, which delivered 453,037 vehicles in 2025 and is targeting between 1 million and 3 million vehicles in 2026. These are not budget alternatives to a Mercedes. They are premium technology products with advanced autonomous driving systems, sophisticated software-defined features, and over-the-air update capabilities that Mercedes-owned China market vehicles do not yet match, and they cost less. Mercedes has responded by announcing partnerships with Momenta for urban autonomous driving and with ByteDance to integrate AI-driven features, targeting a 10% reduction in local material costs and a 20% cut in variable production costs by 2027, and developing 7 China-exclusive models specifically for the domestic market. a tacit acknowledgement that its global platform strategy no longer works in China. BMW's response has been different in degree but similar in direction. BMW delivered 625,427 vehicles in China in 2025, with EV sales globally growing 6% to 442,072 units, a better performance than Mercedes on the EV side, but still deeply inadequate relative to the growth of the overall market. BMW reported an 8% revenue decline and a 29% profit drop in the first half of 2025. The company plans to introduce more than 20 models in China in 2026, including the next generation iX3, but its EVs still account for a relatively small share of total China sales, and China's new energy vehicle penetration exceeded 50% of all new passenger cars sold in the country in 2025, meaning that more than half of every car being bought by a Chinese consumer is now electric or plug-in hybrid, and the majority of those buyers are choosing domestic brands. The combined market share of Volkswagen, Audi, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Porsche, Germany's 5 major passenger car brands, had fallen to just 6% of China's EV market by early 2026, according to CarScoop's reporting on April 2026 data. That figure is not a typo. The combined EV share of the 5 brands that dominated European automotive engineering for most of the 20th century had reached 6% of the world's largest electric vehicle market. Ford's situation is different in character from the German brands, because Ford's strategic problem in China predates the EV transition and has been compounded by it rather than created by it. Changan Ford's 99,400 vehicle sales in China in 2025, down from 247,000 in 2024, represent the end stage of a decade-long decline that saw Ford's China market share fall from 5% in 2017 to approximately 2% in 2024, before the Changan Ford joint venture's numbers fell off a cliff entirely in 2025. Ford has lost $13 billion on its EV business since 2023, according to reporting from the National Legal and Policy Center, citing Ford's own disclosed figures. Its domestic U.S. EV deliveries fell 69% in January 2026 and 71% in February 2026, year on year, extending what the company's own investor communications described as the steepest decline in its EV history, driven primarily by the expiration of federal tax credits at the end of 2025 that had been supporting demand. Ford CEO Jim Farley has publicly described the company's response as a Model T moment, scrapping plans for large EVs and pivoting to a next generation of smaller, more affordable electric models built on a new platform, with the first vehicle expected in 2027 using lower-cost LFP batteries licensed from CATL, the same Chinese company that supplies Tesla. Ford's most competitive response to Chinese electric vehicles, in other words, is a vehicle that uses Chinese battery technology, built to a price point that Chinese manufacturers can already meet with existing products, arriving in 2027 into a market that will have moved considerably further in the intervening 2 years. The question that nobody in any boardroom in Stuttgart or Dearborn is answering in plain language is the one that matters most for understanding where this actually ends. It is not whether Chinese electric vehicles are technically competitive. They demonstrably are, and the sales data confirms it with a consistency that cannot be explained by subsidy distortion alone. The question is whether the cost gap, the battery manufacturing advantage, the software iteration speed, and the scale of Chinese domestic production infrastructure represent a temporary lead that Western manufacturers can close through sustained investment, or whether they represent a structural reconfiguration of where automotive value is created globally that is closer to permanent than temporary. The Bloomberg NEF battery price data suggests the latter. A 13% decline in Chinese battery pack prices in a single year, against a 4% decline in North America, is not a gap that closes through incremental efficiency improvement. The lowest observed cell prices in China in 2025 were $36 per kilowatt hour, according to Bloomberg NEF's own data. For LFP cells going into stationary storage, the lowest pack prices were $50 per kilowatt hour. These are not prices that any Western manufacturer is currently producing at or can produce at without the Chinese supply chain infrastructure that underlies them. And building that infrastructure from scratch at Western labor costs with Western raw material sourcing against the headwinds of Chinese manufacturers who have already been operating at scale for 15 years is a project measured in decades and hundreds of billions of dollars of sustained state and private investment that no Western government has committed to at anywhere near the required scale. If you're still watching at this point, subscribe now, because the follow-up to this video, what European governments are actually planning, what the tariff war does or does not accomplish, and whether any Western automaker has a credible path back to competitive manufacturing, is the most important story in global industry right now, and we are going to cover every piece of it. Here's where the honest version of the story refuses to resolve into the simple narrative that either side of the debate wants. The Chinese automotive industry's success is real and documented, but it also carries complications that the most enthusiastic accounts of China's EV dominance consistently underweight. The domestic Chinese market in 2025 was, by the accounts of the manufacturers operating inside it, brutal in a way that is actively destroying the companies that cannot survive the price war. GUA, an EV startup that had seemed well capitalized and was growing, collapsed in 2024, leaving suppliers and partners holding debt they had no mechanism to recover. CNN's September 2025 investigation found that even frontrunners were squeezing parts makers to sell below cost while extending payment terms for months, with coating materials suppliers in some cases forced to cut prices by more than 40% just to retain contracts. An insurance manager at a Chinese EV company told CNN's reporters that car makers had made cost-cutting and efficiency the core of their operations instead of focusing on innovation, and that the overall quality of components had undeniably declined as a result of the pressure. Zeekr and Neda, according to a July 2025 Reuters investigation, had been inflating sales data by exploiting China's vehicle insurance registration system. The Chinese EV market is not a story of clean, uncomplicated triumph. It is a story of extraordinary scale and technological achievement existing alongside overcapacity so severe that even the strongest companies are operating on compressed margins with meaningful government subsidy underwriting their profitability. BYD's net profit of $7 billion in 2025 was down 19% year on year, and government subsidies of approximately $1. $8 billion represented 38. 2% of that net profit figure, according to Trendex Insights analysis of BYD's full-year results. But here is the critical distinction that separates the complicated domestic picture from the internationally competitive picture. None of those domestic complications change the fact that a BYD Seagull, the company's entry-level battery electric vehicle, starts at a price that makes any comparable Western electric vehicle look like it was designed for a different economic reality. None of them change the fact that Chinese battery packs cost $84 per kilowatt hour, while North American packs cost 44% more. None of them change the fact that in China, electric vehicles have already reached price parity with internal combustion engine vehicles across most segments, a threshold that Western markets, with their higher battery costs and smaller manufacturing scale, have not yet crossed and may not cross for years. The domestic complications are real. The international competitive advantage is also real. And the international advantage does not depend on the domestic complications being resolved. What happens to European and American consumers in this picture is the part of the story that gets least attention and coverage, that is primarily about manufacturers and markets. Mercedes losing 19% of its China sales is a problem for Mercedes shareholders, for the workers in German factories who build Mercedes vehicles, and for the supply chains that feed those factories. It is less obviously a problem for the person in Stuttgart who wants to buy an electric car. That person, if they can access Chinese electric vehicles, which depends heavily on tariff policy, which depends heavily on which government is in office, which varies by country and changes with elections, gets access to better technology at a lower price than they can currently access from their domestic manufacturer. The European Union imposed tariffs of between 7%, 8%, and 3% on Chinese electric vehicles in October 2024, in addition to the existing 10% import duty, specifically to slow the competitive displacement of European manufacturers by Chinese equivalents. The United States maintains a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles that effectively prevents any Chinese passenger car from entering the American market. Canada reduced its tariff from 100% to 1% for up to 49,000 vehicles in 2026. Each of these policy choices represents a decision about who bears the cost of the competitive gap, whether it falls on the manufacturers who can no longer compete without protection, or on the consumers who would pay less for a better product if the protection were removed. That is the question that sits underneath every number in this video, and that no government on either side of the Atlantic has answered in plain language for the people whose purchasing decisions are actually affected by it. The cars have changed. China changed them. And the choice that Western governments and Western consumers now face is not whether to acknowledge that change. The sales figures of Mercedes-Benz and BMW and Changan Ford make that choice unavoidable, but what to do about it, and who pays the cost of the adjustment in the years before Western manufacturers either close the gap or accept that the gap is permanent. That answer is genuinely unknown. What is known is that Mercedes sold 551,900 vehicles in China in 2025, down 19%. That BMW sold 625,527, down 12%. 5%. That Chang'an Ford sold 99,400, down 60% from 247,000 the previous year. And that BYD delivered 4,602,000, or 236 new energy vehicles globally, exported more than 1 million for the first time, and charged its best-selling sedan from 10 to 97% in 9 minutes on a production platform that didn't exist 18 months ago. Those numbers do not tell you what the right policy is. They do tell you that the industry has already changed, that the change is compounding, and that the organizations that are going to determine what comes next have not yet told the people most affected by it what they actually plan to do. Tell me in the comments whether you think tariffs are the right response to this, or whether they are just delaying a reckoning that is going to arrive regardless of what any government decides. Because that specific question, protection versus adaptation, is where I think the most honest and most difficult disagreement in this entire story actually lives. And if you want to keep following it as it develops, the next quarterly results from BMW, the next BYD export milestone, the next tariff negotiation, subscribe now, because this story is not even close to finished,